The vibration rattled my teeth before the sound even hit us, a deep chest-thumping roar that tore the air apart. 2 F-22 Raptors screamed overhead, banking so hard I could clearly see the pilot's helmet through the canopy, their landing gear deploying like talons reaching for prey. The wind from their wake hit the tarmac like a physical blow, knocking the crystal champagne flute right out of my uncle's hand and sending it shattering across the asphalt. My Uncle Richard, usually so composed in his Italian loafers and tailored linen suit, looked like he was about to faint right there on the runway. He was pale, sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically between the screaming fighter jets and the convoy of black armored SUVs swarming his precious Gulfstream. I, on the other hand, just checked my watch. 14 hours exactly, right on schedule. A voice boomed over a military-grade loudspeaker, cutting through the turbine whine like a knife. Unidentified civilian craft, you are in proximity to a Tier 1 asset. Power down immediately, or you will be engaged. My Uncle Richard thought he owned the sky because he bought a plane. He didn't know that for the last decade, I've been the one guarding it. To understand how we ended up with a tactical team pointing automatic rifles at a family birthday party, you have to go back 3 days. We were gathered at the sprawling estate of my Uncle Richard, a venture capitalist, who believed your human value was directly correlated to your net assets. He was holding court in the sunken living room, announcing his birthday trip to a private island like he was bestowing a royal decree upon his grateful subjects. I tried to be polite. I really tried to give him an out without breaking protocol. I really can't, Richard, I said, keeping my voice low to avoid a scene. I have work restrictions right now. Specific travel protocols I have to follow. It was the absolute truth, a very simplified version of a classified reality, but to him, it sounded like a pathetic excuse from a nobody who didn't understand how the wealthy lived. He laughed. A loud, barking sound that made everyone else stop talking and turn to look at me. Elena, you work a desk job at the DMV or whatever government agency it is, he sneered, loud enough for the back of the room to hear. I'm sure the paperwork can wait. Or are you just afraid of flying in real luxury? The room went quiet, waiting for the punchline, and I felt that familiar heat rise in my chest. I thought about the briefing I had just given to the Joint Chiefs, the lives that depended on my analysis, and then I looked at my uncle, who saw nothing but a failed niece in a cheap blazer. He grinned, looking around for validation. Don't worry, you can sit in the back. It's nicer than the economy seats you're used to. The family chuckled, a polite, obedient chorus that sealed my decision. He thought he was being generous. He had no idea he was forcing a collision between his ego and the United States Air Force's most restrictive security protocols. In my family, value was calculated on a spreadsheet, and by their math, I was firmly in the red. The star of the afternoon gathering was my cousin Mark, a man whose smile was as polished and superficial as the luxury sedans he sold for a living. He had just closed on a high-end dealership and Uncle Richard was beaming at him like he'd just discovered fire. They clinked expensive glasses, toasting to real ambition, while I stood on the periphery nursing a lukewarm soda, invisible as always. Richard turned to me, his eyes gleaming with that specific brand of pity reserved for the disappointing relative. It's cute you have a pension, Elena, he said, his voice carrying that patronizing lilt that always made my stomach turn. But real success is equity. Owning something. You can't pass a government paycheck down to your kids. I just nodded, swallowing the retort that was burning my throat. I looked at Mark's flashy watch and the lease suit, and then I thought about the document I had signed 3 days ago, a budget authorization that exceeded the GDP of a small country. They saw a woman in a generic blazer who probably stamped license plate renewals for a living. They had no idea that 48 hours prior, I wasn't sitting in a cubicle, I was deep underground in a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility where the air is scrubbed and cell phones are strictly prohibited. I am not a clerk, I am the Chief Systems Integration Officer for the NGAD program, the Next Generation Air Dominance Initiative. While Mark was worrying about interest rates on a convertible, I was briefing a 2-star general on the integration of autonomous wingman drones into the national defense grid. I remembered the silence of that room, the heavy weight of responsibility as I pointed to the encrypted displays. "General," I had said, my voice steady, "without the threat library update, the neural link is vulnerable. We cannot proceed with the live test until we clear the new patch." The general didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with absolute deference, because he knew that in that room, my technical authority outranked his stars. My world was defined by Yankee white background checks and SAP, special access programs, where a single leaked sentence could compromise national security for a decade. This duality was exhausting, but it was usually manageable until my security detail stepped in. I thought about Major Ghost Vance, a man who moved so quietly you often forgot he was lethal until he spoke. He was my liaison and personal protection, tasked with ensuring the NGAD secrets in my head didn't end up in the wrong hands. Before I left for this vacation, Vance had pulled me aside, his face grim. "Ma'am, with the current threat level on the prototype, your travel is restricted." He had warned me, his eyes scanning the perimeter even as we spoke. "If you fly civilian, we need 48 hours to clear the flight path. We can't have you in the air without a net." That was the reality crashing into my uncle's ego. Standing there in his living room, I tried to bridge the gap without violating the Espionage Act. I cleared my throat, interrupting Richard's monologue about the superiority of private aviation. "Richard," I said, keeping my tone mild, "if we're taking your jet, I need to submit the pilot's information and the flight manifest for a standard background check." It was a simple request in my world, a mandatory box to check to ensure I wasn't boarding a plane with a foreign asset. But in Richard's world, it was an insult. He stopped laughing, his face turning a mottled shade of red as he set his glass down a little too hard. "I don't submit to background checks for my own plane, Elena." He exploded, the veins in his neck bulging. "Who do you think you are? You work for the government, you aren't the government." I tried to interject, to explain that it wasn't about him, but he cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You're paranoid," he spat, turning his back on me to refill his drink. "Just get on the jet and shut up. I'm not letting your bureaucratic nonsense ruin my birthday." I stood there, watching him dismiss the very architecture of safety that allowed him to sleep at night. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest, the kind I usually reserved for mission-critical failures. I had two choices: breach protocol and lose my clearance, or let the system do exactly what it was designed to do. I decided to let Richard learn the hard way why you don't surprise the Pentagon. I didn't argue with Richard, and I certainly didn't beg. Instead, I stepped into the hallway, away from the laughter and the clinking glasses, and pulled out my secure phone. The one my family assumed was a cheap prepaid model because it didn't have a fruit logo on the back. I opened the DoD travel app, keyed in my uncle's tail number, and selected non-secure civilian transport. The screen immediately flashed a violent pulsing red, warning, asset exposure high. I stared at the warning for a heartbeat, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction settle in my chest. I didn't cancel the trip. I simply typed in the override code, familial obligation, requesting overwatch. When we arrived at the private hangar the next morning, the contrast between my two lives was almost comical. My family looked like a catalog for high-end resort wear, linen suits, silk scarves, and designer sunglasses that cost more than my first car. I was dressed in practical travel gear, blending into the background like I always did. They saw a poor relation trying not to embarrass them. I saw a variable entering a hostile environment. Richard was in his element, practically vibrating with ego as he ushered us toward the jet. He introduced his private pilot, Captain Lewis, a man with a jawline he clearly admired in the mirror, and a dismissive smirk he aimed directly at me. As I walked up the stairs, glancing instinctively at the avionics array, Lewis chuckled. "Don't touch the flight controls, sweetie," he said, winking at my uncle. "This bird's a little more complex than a Toyota." I just smiled. The tight, polite smile of someone who knows exactly how this movie ends. I added the comment to the mental archive, right next to every time they told me I wasn't smart enough for real business. Before anyone could board, I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Richard," I said, holding my ground. "Federal travel laws." I have to scan my ID into the flight manifest system for insurance purposes. It's non-negotiable. Richard rolled his eyes so hard I thought he might hurt himself. Fine, he groaned, waving his hand at the pilot like he was swatting a fly. Scan her little library card so we can go. Captain Lewis sighed, holding out his iPad like he was doing me a massive charity. I pulled out my common access card, the white plastic rectangle that holds the keys to the kingdom, and slid it into the reader attached to his tablet. The screen didn't just beep, it froze. A strange, heavy silence seemed to radiate from the device, though the pilot was too busy looking at his watch to notice the silent alarm pulsing in the corner. He thought he was just logging a passenger. He had no idea he had just pinged the National Defense Grid. The data packet left the iPad, bounced off a satellite, and landed on a server at the National Reconnaissance Office. The response time wasn't measured in minutes. It was measured in Mach. The engines were whining, building thrust for takeoff, while inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with self-congratulatory excess. Uncle Richard was standing in the aisle, balancing a crystal flute of champagne, making a toast that was really just another thinly veiled insult disguised as wisdom. To those who have, he announced, raising his glass toward Mark, and to those who have not. He cast a pointed, pitying glance in my direction. I didn't flinch. I just sat there, thinking about the years of hand-me-down clothes and the lectures on fiscal responsibility he used to give me while I was secretly managing a black budget portfolio that could buy his entire firm 10 times over. The toast was cut short by the crackle of the intercom. Captain Lewis, the pilot who had sneered at me 10 minutes ago, sounded like he was strangling the microphone. Sir. His voice trembled, stripping away all that cocky aviator swagger. ATC just grounded us. Immediate halt. The plane lurched violently as he killed the throttle, throwing Richard off balance. Before my uncle could demand an explanation, Lewis spoke again, his voice pitching up in panic. They say we have an unauthorized high-value asset on board without secure clearance. They're threatening to intercept. Richard looked confused, his face scrunching up in that specific way it did when a waiter got his order wrong. What are you talking about? This is a private flight. But his protest was drowned out by a sound that you feel in your marrow before you hear it with your ears. The cabin walls vibrated as 2 F-22 Raptors screamed over the runway, banking hard in. A combat air patrol pattern that is usually reserved for war zones or presidential escorts. Through the porthole window, I saw the ground swarm with activity, a phalanx of black SUVs with government plates tore across the tarmac, cutting off the jet's nose gear in a synchronized drift. The cabin door didn't open, it was breached with precise, aggressive speed. These weren't local cops or airport security rent-a-cops. These were Air Force security forces, defenders, flanked by men in sharp, dark suits who moved with terrifying fluidity. Richard, recovering from his shock, decided to play the only card he had ever held. He puffed up his chest, stepping into the aisle to block their path. "I'll sue you," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is private property. Do you know who I am?" The lead officer didn't even blink. He looked through my uncle as if he were made of glass, just a minor, annoying obstruction in the path of a mission. He sidestepped Richard without a word, his boots heavy on the plush carpet, and walked straight to my seat in the back, the economy section Richard had relegated me to. The officer stopped, snapped his heels together, and delivered a salute so sharp it could have cut steel. "Ma'am." "Call sign Valkyrie," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Your transponder indicated you were in a non-secure environment. We are here to facilitate transfer to secure transport." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolutely delicious. Richard froze, his mouth hanging open, his eyes darting from the armed soldiers to his failure of a niece. The officer turned to him then, his expression cold and bureaucratic. "Sir, you are in violation of Federal Airspace Regulation 99.7 regarding the transport of Tier -1 classified personnel. Step away from the asset?" I stood up, taking my time to smooth the wrinkles from my cheap blazer. I looked at Mark, who was cowering in his seat, and then at Richard, who looked small, pale, and utterly powerless for the first time in his life. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I just looked him in the eye. "Uncle Richard, I told you," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I couldn't fly economy. My contract requires specific legroom." He watched me walk down the stairs of his private jet and into a government SUV that cost more than his entire house. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. The silence inside the government SUV was absolute, a sharp, hermetically sealed contrast to the chaos I had just left behind on the tarmac. As the heavy door thudded shut, cutting off the view of my uncle's panicked face, I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I was 12 years old. I sank into the leather seat, watching the airfield blur past through tinted, bulletproof glass. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the poor relation or the black sheep. I felt like a weapon that had finally been unholstered. We pulled up to the far side of the airfield, where a Gulfstream C-37 Billions, a military transport that makes civilian luxury look like a toy, was waiting with its engines already humming a low, powerful note. Major Ghost Vance was standing at the base of the stairs, checking a tablet with the bored efficiency of a man who has seen everything. He looked up as I climbed out of the SUV, a small, knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Cut it a little close, didn't you, boss?" he asked, his voice competing with the whine of the turbines. Command was about 30 seconds away from scrambling a second wave. I just smiled, adjusting the collar of my blazer as I walked past him, feeling the familiar vibration of the metal stairs under my boots. "Asset secured, Major," I said, stepping into the cabin. It smelled like recycled air and coffee, the scent of work, of mission, of home. I didn't look back at the private terminal. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening, and the satisfaction was a cold, quiet thing settling in my chest. As we banked hard into the ascent, I looked out the porthole window one last time. From 2,000 feet, my Uncle Richard's massive ego looked incredibly small. I could see the flashing lights of the federal vehicles surrounding his jet like sharks circling a wounded whale. He was currently being introduced to the reality of the Federal Aviation Administration and the FBI, organizations that do not care about your net worth, your summer home, or who you play golf with. I imagined the conversation happening down there. The FAA inspectors were likely already pulling the pilot's logbooks, initiating a ramp check that would turn into a forensic audit of every flight hour Captain Lewis had ever recorded. The FBI agents would be asking Richard why he attempted to transport a SAP-cleared individual without a filed flight plan, a violation that triggers automatic inclusion on several very inconvenient watch lists. His birthday vacation wasn't just canceled, it was incinerated. His plane, the symbol of his freedom and status, was now a flagged asset, grounded, indefinitely pending a full security sweep that would take months to complete. By the time we reached cruising altitude, I had already opened my secure laptop. The family drama felt miles away, irrelevant against the backdrop of the threat analysis scrolling across my screen. But the silence that followed in the days to come was deafening. The family group chat, usually a ceaseless stream of Richard's humble brags and photos of expensive dinners, went completely dead. There were no jokes about my job, no snide comments about my economy lifestyle. They had seen the F-22 seconds. They had seen the salutes. They had realized, in a terrifying instant, that the hierarchy they had built their lives around was a lie. It took a full week for the notification to come. I was in the hangar, standing on the gantry above the prototype, running a final diagnostic on the optical sensor array. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a single, hesitant vibration. I pulled it out and saw Richard's name. It wasn't a phone call, he didn't have the courage for that. It was a text message, long and clearly drafted by a lawyer, stripped of all the arrogance he usually wore like cologne. "Elena," it read, "I hope you got back safely. There seems to be a misunderstanding with the FAA regarding the tail number on the Gulfstream. My legal team says there is a Tier 1 security hold on the asset. They suggested you might be able to clarify the situation. We would appreciate your help clearing the flag." I stared at the screen, and the internal ledger I had kept for 20 years flipped open in my mind. I thought about the time he refused to co-sign my student loan because it was a bad investment. I thought about the holidays where I was seated at the kids' table in my 30s. I thought about the way he looked at me on that runway, not with love, but with fear. He still didn't get it. He thought this was a favor he could trade for, a string he could pull. He didn't understand that some doors, once locked by the mechanism of the state, do not open just because you ask nicely. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't even feel vindicated. I just felt busy. I looked up at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip below. The mountains, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fire. I had a test pilot briefing in 10 minutes, and a defense strategy that needed to be rewritten by morning. I tapped the screen once, selecting the message. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it. I simply pressed archive. My uncle spent his life thinking power was something you hoarded in a bank account. As the afterburners kicked in, leaving him on the ground, I hoped he finally understood. Real power isn't about what you own. It's about who protects you when the world goes dark. If you've ever had to hide your success to keep the peace, let me know in the comments. This channel is cleared for takeoff.